Hey guys, thanks for checking out another episode of Tales from a Small Town Journalist, the podcast that's dedicated to all the amusing and sometimes just plain weird experiences that you are only going to hear about from small town community newspaper reporters like myself. I'm MattSchorr and I will be your host throughout this experience. You know, I was a full-time reporter for almost 10 years of my life, and during that time I accrued a whole wealth of just bizarre, just hilarious types of experiences and stories that could only happen in a small town like the one that I was living in at that time. And of course, it's not just me. All small town reporters have these unique stories. And we're going to hear from another person who's got some really unique stories, George Robinson, the sports writer for the Leaf-Chronicle newspaper in Clarksville, Tennessee. And we'll get to him very shortly, but first I thought I'd catch you guys up on a little bit of what's going on in my life right now. As you know, last month was Valentine's Day, and I celebrated it in a pretty traditional fashion. I had flowers sent to my wife at work. Just a quick little tidbit of advice to the gentlemen out there: if you're married, you cannot go wrong sending your wife flowers on Valentine's Day. You very often can go wrong by not sending her flowers. So, just that's my personal advice. Take it as you will. But that really wasn't the big gift that I got her. The big gift I got her was tickets to the Trans World Halloween and Attraction Show in St. Louis, Missouri. That show's going to be coming up March 21st through the 24th. This is actually the second time that I got her tickets to this big event. I did it last year as well. I had this big elaborate plan. I was going to register ahead of time, get the tickets without her knowing about it. Then I was going to print this really cool looking card with their logo, and I was going to tuck that into a Valentine's card and give it to her and act like it was just this humble little card that I was giving to her. And then she was going to open it up and see this big thing saying, we're going to go see some more Halloween. Because for those who know us, they know very well that we are huge Halloween fans. For those who don't, I'm going to tell you right now, we are just fanatical Halloween fans. We deck out our house every year. We made a special pilgrimage to Salem, Massachusetts on October, just to be a part of Witch City and be a part of all that stuff. And now we're dying to go to St. Helens, Oregon, where they filmed the Halloween Town series. And I really want to go see New Orleans for, all the obvious reasons there. But I digress. The problem with my whole plan last year was they required an email for your registration. Now, of course, had I been smarter than I was, I'll just admit that, this wouldn't have been an issue. I could have just put my own personal email address for both of us and been done with it. That's not what I did. I put my email address and I provided my wife's email address. And in so doing, we both got alerts that we had registered successfully. So I got this panic text from Amanda saying, I got this thing saying I spent all this money to go to this show and I promise I didn't do anything. So I had to tell her, look, don't worry about it. It's nothing. Just forget it happened. She's like, are you sure? Yeah. Just forget it. And she didn't believe me. She knew something was up. And every time for like weeks, she would say, What was that thing that I got? I'm saying, nothing. Don't talk about it. Don't worry about it. It's nothing. Just forget it. Just nothing. And then finally got her the card, and there it was. And it was not the big grand surprise that I had hoped that it would be. So this year I tried again. The problem is that this time around, I'm already following Trans World stuff on Facebook and Twitter and everything, and I'm sharing it and retweeting it and saying how cool all this stuff looks, and without stopping to think of the ramifications of this. And she was pretty well aware that I had planned on taking us back there again. It's the worst kept secret in the world, but what can you do? She was still pretty excited to get the tickets, still excited to go, and I am excited to go as well. Like I said earlier, it'll be at the end of this month, and if you follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/SchorrManor, you will be able to see all kinds of photos and videos and all kinds of other stuff that we'll be doing. I will, of course, probably do a recap in my next episode of this, but if you want stuff in the meantime, hey, feel free to follow us there. I'll get into all of those plugs about our social media pages, our Patreon pages, all that great stuff at the end of the show. But for now, let's get George Robinson on the phone because, as he has alerted me, he's got some pretty unique and entertaining and just wild stories that he's going to tell us. All right, I am here with George Robinson, sports reporter for the Leaf-Chronicle in Clarksville, Tennessee. George and I actually worked together for a couple of years when I was still at the Leaf-Chronicle, although we had different news beats, so our paths didn't really cross all that much. However, we did work in the same newsroom, so George, would it be accurate to say that at the very least we were aware of each other?
Yeah, I think you could say that at the very least we were aware of each other, yeah.
We worked in the same office, about 20 feet apart, so at the very least we knew the other guy was there. So So George has actually worked at several newspapers over the course of his career, kind of similar to me. I've worked at more than one, and during that time has accrued quite a few rather interesting stories. I'm going to say up front that I don't know much of anything about what we're going to hear right now. All that I have gathered is that these stories are the result of as you put it, I think it was lack of sleep and poor decision making that resulted of that. Is that right?
Right, exactly. I mean, I'm a sports writer, so we essentially most sports writers have essentially worked what would be regarded as the second shift. So we'll come in early afternoon, and we'll work late into the night because obviously sports are being played at nighttime. So we're there covering those games and then getting back usually on deadline, having to write stories, get photos in. So our nights are usually pretty late. And most of my career, and I've been doing this for over 20 years, I on average, I get home probably at around 11. But, there's some parts of the year where, you don't get home until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And that's sort of how these series of stories that I have deal with my years when I was working in Hopkinsville at the Kentucky New Era. And I covered a lot more. Here in Clarksville, I cover mostly just high school sports. I cover a little bit of Austin Peay, but mostly high school sports. But when I was in Kentucky, in Hopkinsville at the New Era, I was actually covering a lot of college. We covered a lot of Tennessee Titans down in Nashville with the NFL football. And, we covered a lot of, like I said, a lot of college sports. So we traveled to Lexington, Kentucky to cover the University of Kentucky Wildcats and football, basketball. We went up to Louisville, covered some Louisville stuff, went to Murray and covered Murray State, and covered some things here at Austin Peay and Clarksville and even Western Kentucky and Bowling Green, Kentucky. So we kind of went just about everywhere around this region. And, like I said, with sports being sort of like you're kind of like a night hawk, coming back from those games, particularly the ones at the University of Kentucky, which if you live in Hopkinsville or ever been to Hopkinsville and have driven all the way to Lexington, which is clear across the other side of the state, it takes about 3.5 hours to drive from Hopkinsville to Lexington, and then another 3.5 hours to drive back. So that's just 6 hours that you spent just in the car driving. And that doesn't count the game that you're covering. So, there were a lot of situations during those years between 1998, 1999 to about 2004, 2005, where, we spent a lot of time, me and our photographer, Danny Val, used to work at the Kentucky New Era in Hopkinsville. Spent a lot of time on the road driving to these games and driving back to Hopkinsville. And in the course of all of that, you sort of lose track of time. You're tired. You kind of lose track of, where you're at. The first story that kind of pops into my mind in particular, was we were making that trip to Lexington, covered the game, was driving back, and we got to about we got to Russellville, Kentucky, which is about 25 minutes from Hopkinsville. So we were about 25 minutes from home, and we're driving through Russellville. And to break up the monotony of that drive, there's two ways you can go. You can usually take Highway 6880, which is just a straight shot from Russellville into Hopkinsville, which is sort of the boring route. It's just it's nothing but farm fields that you can see as far as the eye can see. Or you can go through Russellville, the town, which has, those old-timey squares in the middle of town that you have to kind of go around. So this particular night, we decided we were going to take the scenic route and go through Russellville, the actual town, because we just didn't feel like going through that boring 6880 pass that runs outside of Russellville into Hopkinsville. So we're driving through, we get into Russellville, we get into town, and I just, we've been driving, for about 3 hours, and I think the fatigue had just really set in, and I was driving. My photographer Danny was in the passenger seat, and the fatigue really set in and really hit me hard. And I remember turning up the radio and trying to wake myself up, trying to stir some kind of reaction out of myself so that I could stay awake for the rest of this 30-minute, 25-minute drive into Hopkinsville. And I noticed I turned over and looked at Danny, and he was already asleep. His head was up against the window on the passenger side, and he was already snoring. And I'm thinking, man, I'm really, really tired. I don't know how long, I'm going to make it here. But I'm thinking, turn up the radio, maybe roll down the window, get some fresh air, try to wake me up. And nothing was working. Nothing was working. And I just, I realized that, I have to really, really sort of kind of hightail it out of Russellville and get home as quickly as possible because my eyes were fading fast. And we get probably about a mile from the Russellville Square. And anybody who's been in Russellville knows that it kind of winds its way to the square. But we did hit a stretch where we were just going straight. It was about a half a mile of just straight road through a kind of a residential neighborhood heading towards the square. And I don't remember much about that straight stretch we hit in Russellville. But the next thing I do remember is essentially waking up as we were coming up to the stop sign where the square was. And not only did I wake up and see the stop sign that was coming up on us fast, but I was driving into somebody's yard.
Oh, gosh.
I was literally in somebody's yard. Not somebody's yard, several people's yards. Because the houses were lined up. Yeah, the houses were lined right up. As you get towards the square, the houses are lined up, a few feet from each other. So I'm driving through people's yards. Maybe half the car is in the yard, the other half's on the road. And I didn't hit anybody's mailbox, but I was about maybe 15 feet from the stop sign when I woke up. And I smashed on the brakes. Danny Val, my photographer, who's asleep in the passenger side, his head goes flying. His head hits the dashboard. My head hits the steering wheel. No airbag pops out. Nothing. So if we had been in a crash, then we would have known that the airbag wouldn't have worked. So that, but I probably stopped maybe 2 or 3 feet from that stop sign. Had I not woken up, had we run through that stop sign, we would have ran straight through that square and hit the courthouse that sits in the middle of that square.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, the courthouse, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know how it still is today, but, this was probably about, this was 2002 or so this is a long time ago. It's about 15, 16 years ago. The courthouse down in the basement had a couple of jail cells in there. And I remember thinking, it wouldn't have taken the police in Russellville 2 minutes to pull us out of the car. Take us into that battered courthouse and take us downstairs to that jailhouse.
Okay. So, were you awake after that?
I was completely awake. I was so awake that by the time I got home in Hawkinsville and got to my apartment, I couldn't go to sleep. It took me another 3 or 4 hours before I could fall asleep. I think I was so shaken by it, so nerve-wracked by it that I couldn't actually calm myself down enough to fall asleep when I got home. So, you can't make that stuff up, man. It's that kind of sleep deprivation just does things to you. And all of these stories that I have sort of revolve around that, and especially making that drive from Hopkinsville to Lexington and then from Lexington back, because the New Era was too cheap to put us up in a hotel. So we had to drive there. We had to drive to Lexington and then cover the game, and then we had to drive back that night. So that was always our scenario. And oftentimes, if it was during the football season, we would cover a UK football game on Saturday, and then we'd have to turn right around. If the Tennessee Titans were playing in Nashville that Sunday, we would turn right around on Sunday morning, drive down to Nashville, cover the Titans, and come back home from there. So for about 5 or 6 years, or actually 6 or 7 years, we did that every fall, and it was, it was brutal. It was brutal. I'd say I'm almost 44 now. That probably took about 3 or 4 years off my life.
Oh, my gosh.
Just doing that took some years off my life.
I believe it. That sounds similar when I worked at a TV station in Paducah, News Channel 6. Not nearly as brutal as yours, of course, but I would work until I worked in the studio, so we'd work right up to the last newscast, which ended at 10:30, and then it was a 30-minute drive back home for me that night, and then Saturday morning, they broadcast at like 6 in the morning, and I had to be there at 5. So then I got home at around 11 o'clock, and then had to be back at work at 5 o'clock the next morning.
Yeah, but TV is often more brutal because of how you guys, or how TV airs their programs, particularly their news programs, and then when you have something like we've been experiencing here with this weather, those meteorologists, they can be there all night long.
Oh, yeah, and a lot of times there were. I think there were times that I left and the meteorologist was there, and then when I got back the next morning, she was still there. I don't think she'd gone home at all.
Yeah. Well, at least they're stationary. They're not driving, and they don't have they're not responsible for another human being who's in the car.
Yeah, there's that. And I really, all things considered, I had it pretty easy because at that time, we just worked the cameras, so that was really all I had to worry about. I didn't have to worry about producing the show and putting everything together without doing all that on lack of sleep.
Right, and also being on-air talent with lack of sleep would be devastating too, because then you're in front of the camera and everybody can see. That's when you get on YouTube and you see the blooper reels from news stations.
You could probably find some that we did.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, listen, we were driving back from a Kentucky game one night, and we were going through. This time, I decided to take the 6880 highway, and we were probably near Elkton, Kentucky, which is in Todd County, which is a little bit closer to Hopkinsville than Russellville is. But we were driving through 6880 on our way back home from a Kentucky game. And it was another late night, so it was probably around 2 o'clock in the morning. And that stretch of 6880 doesn't have any lights, or it didn't when I was, back, 15, 20 years ago. It didn't have much lights at all. So it was it was really dark. I had my brights on, so all I had was my headlights. And I'm driving along, and then all of a sudden, it looked as though some animal had hurdled the hood of our car. Now, 6880, I think the speed limit was 65. So if the speed limit is 65, back then, I'm 26, 27 years old. I'm going probably close to 80. So now again, same photographer, same situation. He's on the passenger side. In fact, as I think about it, the photographer never drove. Danny Val never drove. I was always driving. Anyway, he was sitting in the passenger seat, and I think he might have been reading or something because the dome light was on. But I swear I saw what I thought was a rabbit jump the hood of the car as I'm driving, down 6880. I look over and I tell Danny, I said, "Hey man, I think a rabbit just jumped over the car." And he looked at me like I was an alien. He said, "You can't be serious." I said, "Yeah, I think something jumped over the car. It looked like a rabbit." He said, "Hey man, you're going about 80 miles an hour. There's no way a rabbit is going to hurdle the hood of the car without you hitting it at 80 miles an hour." And I told him, to this day, that story's sort of one of those funny things that still gets told at the Kentucky New Era, and I haven't worked there in 12 or 13 years. But for some reason, that story still gets told that a rabbit, that I claim that a rabbit hurdled the car. Now, I don't know if it was a rabbit, but something jumped that car as I was driving on that stretch of highway between Elkton, Kentucky and Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Now, maybe it was some other animal, but I'm telling you, I saw it with my two eyes. Dan claims that it did not happen. He says it's impossible, just straight physics, it would be impossible. And I understand the physics aspect of it, but I have to say that I also believe what my eyes were telling me. But I also admit that, yes, I was sleep deprived, and yes, it was 2 a.m. in the morning. So maybe there could be a possibility that I imagined it. But I have to say that if I did imagine it, it was the most realistic imagine thing that I've ever had. I mean, I would have swore to you up and down that something jumped the hood of that car when I was driving it. But I kind of get how the speed of which I was driving and the speed in which it would take a rabbit to, hurdle a hood of a car that's going 80 miles an hour and not get hit by it, would have to be, incredible. But maybe it was just an incredible rabbit that particular night.
Could have been. Rabbit with some really incredible legs, too, to be able to jump that high.
Yeah, See, I didn't even think about that. Maybe it was, I'm not in Australia, so it's not a kangaroo, unless somebody had a pet kangaroo that got loose in Elkton, Kentucky. But
I can't help wondering if it's that rabbit from the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the one that killed half the party.
It could very well have been. But I saw on Facebook a couple of months ago, a guy was driving. I'm assuming it wasn't a doctored video, but there was a guy that was driving on some country road, and a deer, I guess it was a buck. He was driving on the road. You could see the buck kind of running, sprinting, full sprint towards the road, and all of a sudden you see the buck just hurdle the car. Now, granted, bucks can jump. I mean, they can really get up high, and they are probably strong enough to be able to hurdle a car, particularly a car that's moving. But it did. I mean, I saw that video. Now I know I had plenty of sleep that day, and I was sitting at work. I only drove from my home to work, which is 10 minutes. So I was not sleep deprived. I saw that video, and I'm thinking, the first thing I thought was, so maybe it is possible that a rabbit could hurdle a car. Maybe not, but a man can dream.
It's true, yeah. I once, I think I was on 24. I wasn't driving for work, but it was late at night, and I was in the left lane, and I just had the thought to get over in the right lane. And I think when I got in the right lane, I don't know, 10, 20 seconds afterwards, I passed this cow that was just trotting along in the left lane of the highway. And I don't know if I slowed down or what, or if that cow was just really, really fast, but it had time to turn and look at me as I went past it, like it was asking, "What the heck are you doing out here?"
A cow on 24?
On 24. No, I was a teenager at the time, so maybe years have kind of embellished this memory, but that's how I recall it. Just this big brown cow just trotting along the highway like it wasn't any kind of big deal for him to be out there. And
that's not impossible. I mean, cows known to wander. If you don't have any kind of barrier, they'll wander anywhere. I had somewhat of a similar encounter. This wasn't necessarily a sleep deprivation type of story, but again, it was a story of when I was working at the Kentucky New Era. It seems like all the crazy stuff happened to me between the ages of 23 to maybe 30 when I was at the Kentucky New Era. But I was on my way to Princeton, Kentucky, up in Caldwell County, which isn't that far from Hopkinsville. It takes probably about 35 minutes. It's probably about a 35-minute drive, but the drive from Hopkinsville to Princeton, Kentucky is very, very windy. It's very country roads, 2 lanes, And I was going to Princeton to cover a high school basketball game. This was like late afternoon. It wasn't dark yet. So I'm on the road driving through, the windy roads through this, through the country basically. And there was a semi-truck in front of me. And he was stopped in the road. He was literally stopped in the road. And I come up on the truck, I slow down, and I stop. And I noticed that there's a kind of a dairy cow in the opposite lane, but he's straddling both lanes. So the truck couldn't really get past him without going off the road and into a ditch. But the other traffic couldn't. They couldn't go through the other lane. So, but this cow was not moving. It would not move. People were honking the horn. The cow just wasn't going to move. And cows aren't known to be the smartest animals in the world anyway. So all that noise, the cow wasn't doing anything. He was just chewing on something. I don't know, maybe his cud or whatever. But the truck driver gets out of his truck, runs to the ditch off the side of the road, picks up this huge, thick branch, just some random branch that's laying on the side of the road. I mean, this thing is thick and it's big. And he takes this thing and just starts whacking the crap out of the cow.
Oh my God!
Now, I don't know if any of your listeners are like, animal rights activists or anything. If they are, they may want to close their ears or, not listen to this portion of it. But I mean, he wailed away on this cow. Wailed away on him for a good minute and a half. And the cow did not move. Did not move. And it just sort of turned its head and looked at him and turned its head back around and kept chewing.
Oh my gosh.
So he goes and he puts the branch down. He gets back in his truck. He tells me to back up. So I'm backing, there's nobody behind me, so I back up. He backs his truck up and then slowly puts it back and forward and turns the truck towards the cow. And I'm thinking, what is he going to ram it? Or, what? And basically what he does is he takes his truck and nudges the cow to the point where it makes the cow move. Either the cow has to move or it's going to get knocked over. So he didn't gas it, but he did force that cow to move by taking his truck and literally pushing the cow out of the way.
that would have been something to see.
It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. And I've seen some, goofy things in my life, but that was one of those things where, I don't ever remember. I do remember, I'm from the city. I'm not from the country. And I went to Western Kentucky University. That's where I went to school. And, Western Kentucky to me was out in the country. That was just my experience. That's how little experience I had with the country. But when I moved to Hopkinsville, when I came out of college, my first job was in Hopkinsville at the Kentucky New Era. I remember my very first day there, I went to go get some gas. And I stopped at a gas station, got out, started pumping the gas, and I turned around because I heard some rustling nearby. I turned around, and about 5 feet from me was a cow grazing. And I thought, well, if I'm not, this is, I'm in the country now. This is the country. Like literally, a cow is eating grass 5 feet away from me, pumping gas in my car. And I thought, did I make a mistake coming out here to live and work? And
oh, the cow's not going to hurt you.
No, but I had never been that close to a cow, so I was trying to pump my gas as fast as possible.
I can picture that.
Yeah. I'm city. I'm a city guy.
Yeah.
Trust me. All city.
That's all right. Takes all kinds. Well, hey, this has been really good. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Well, I even got one more story for you if you got time.
Yeah, sure. Let's hear it.
This one is a little darker. It's a little darker considering the prank that we pulled.
Oh no,
but,
pranks are involved.
It came from the heart. But it also came from, again, sleep deprivation, so we probably weren't thinking and making the best decision. But we're the usual suspects, me and my photographer, Danny Val, on the way back from a Kentucky game. But this particular game, I think the game started at 11 a.m., so it was over by mid-afternoon or so. So we get done with our we get done with everything, and we're on our way back, and it's still light outside, which was a treat for us because, anytime we were leaving Lexington, go back to Hopkinsville, it was usually always at night, and usually we didn't get back into Hopkinsville until 2 or 3 a.m. But this particular day, we thought, this is going to be fantastic because we're going to be able to get back at a decent time. But the only problem is, we had to leave Hopkinsville maybe at around 4 or 5 a.m., so we had to get up super early. And we were up late the previous night covering some high school football game. So that's where the tiredness comes in, even though we got back home at a decent time that Saturday after the football game. So we're on our way back from Lexington, and we still probably have we haven't even gotten close to Bowling Green yet. So we had been on the road for probably about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. But we were already tired, from having to get up early and drive to Lexington and then on our way back. But we were bored, obviously, which is the reason for the phone call that we gave our sports editor, whose name was Joe Wilson. We decided we were going to give him a call and, sort of prank him. We thought it would be funny if we called him up and started to talk to him and then pretend that we were in the midst of an automobile accident. So we call him up. He answers the phone. We start talking to him, normal conversation. And then all of a sudden, it was Danny Val's job to kickstart the whole prank by screaming in the passenger side. So Danny starts to scream, and I immediately start in on how I'm losing control of the wheel. So you got both of us screaming, yelling. I'm talking, I got the phone on speaker. Danny's yelling and screaming. I'm screaming that I'm losing control, and I turned the radio up real loud because I couldn't really make the. We were actually on the interstate, so I couldn't really make the car. Couldn't make the tire squealing noise.
Uh-huh.
That would really put us. That would have been the worst decision on top of the bad decision that we were already making. So I turned the radio up real loud. We had it on some rock station, and I don't know, some guitar solo was playing. So I thought that sounds a little bit like tire screeching. At least that particular song did. So I turned the radio up real loud. Danny screaming, I'm yelling, and then I just cut the phone off. I just hang up the phone immediately. Hang up the phone, and we're thinking, oh man, that's the greatest prank. That's got to be the greatest prank ever. That's gonna be a classic. I'd say about 15 minutes later, our sports editor calls us back up, and it sounds like he had just ran a marathon. He was huffing and puffing on the phone, and he's out of breath, and he's, are you guys okay? Are do I need to call the ambulance? And we're sitting there cracking up, just laughing, having the best time with it. When we got back to the paper later on that day, he didn't speak to us for at least the next week because of that. He was telling us, I almost called the cops, almost called the state police in Kentucky, the ones near Lexington, and almost had them out there, coming to see about you guys, and scared the absolute crap out of me. And then that's when we kind of realized that probably wasn't. It was funny to us at the time, and it was a brilliant idea. The idea was perfect, and we even executed it pretty doggone good. But in retrospect, considering the feelings that we hurt and sort of played with, probably wasn't the best idea in the world. But like I said, when you're working off of very little sleep and you're bored and you're making these drives across the state of Kentucky constantly, your mind just takes you to just these weird places, and sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's subconscious. But there's a lot of interesting, weird little things that happened to me, mostly when I was in Hopkinsville. And now that I'm in Clarksville, I have a wife and I got kids now. Life has kind of settled down. I'm not quite as adventurous as I used to be. So those stories have been much tamer since I've been here in Clarksville. But in Hopkinsville, man, it was a mess. I was a mess.
Oh, well. We got good stories to tell out of it, though, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, yeah, we'll definitely have to do this again sometime, because it sounds like you've got quite a few more you could tell, am I right?
Well, I got quite a few I can tell. There's some I could never tell.
Okay. Well, I won't push.
There's some that may not ever make the light of day. But I got a lot of stories like that. There's a bobcat story. There's a story of me trying to fix my air condition in my apartment complex and setting it on fire.
Oh, man.
There's all kinds. There's again, I have to say to all your listeners, I was 20 something, so cut me some slack.
Well, fair enough.
I'm almost in my mid 40s now, so I know better.
Well, I got to say, with a teaser like that, yeah, we'll definitely have to follow up again to get some of those tales.
I was an idiot. Let me just say that. I was an idiot.
That's okay. We all were at that age. But just want to say thanks very much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, no, man. No problem, man. It's been fun.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll do it again.
Now that I remember who you were when you were working here at the Leaf-Chronicle.
That's right. We were at least aware of one another, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, that'll do it. So thank you again, George. We'll catch up with you again sometime.
Yeah, anytime, man.
Okay, there you have it. George's night riding shenanigans. There's a part of me that's kind of jealous that I don't have stories like that I can tell since I was in a different wing of the newsroom. But there's also the rest of me is pretty thankful that I never had to do late night drives like that one. So, kudos to George. If you are a subscriber to the Leaf-Chronicle, if you live in the Clarksville area, make sure that if you happen to come across George Robinson, let him know he's doing a good job. And for everybody else in your own communities, if you happen to meet up with the sports writers for your own respective newspapers, let them know that they're doing a good job as well. Reporters don't hear that sort of thing nearly enough. I know that I say this every episode, but I'm going to say it again. It is crucial to support your local newspapers. It's more important today than it's ever been at any point in our history. You're just not going to get good local news coverage like that from any other source out there. And with that, I'm going to move on to the next segment of this show where I open the floor up to anybody out there who's got questions for me, where I let listeners send in their questions. This question comes from Stephanie Hogarth, and Stephanie asks, what is the weirdest thing that you have ever covered? Well, to be honest with you, it's hard to narrow that down because there's just been a lot of things that I've covered. They've all been to varying degrees of strangeness, I guess you could say. And some people, of course, might find one thing strange and others might not. But if I'm going to pick one right now, the one that comes to mind that might be the most bizarre was the time that I was called out to a crash scene that involved an overturned diesel truck full of pigs. Just what it sounds like. They were transporting pigs, and it just overturned out on this old country road. I can't really go into a whole lot of details about it, but I'll just say that I thought I would go up to this thing finding like blood in the road and just a horrible, horrifying sight. And there was none of that. The animals were pretty shaken up, but otherwise, it's just overturned truck that just happened to be full of pigs. So that's one of the weirdest things, I guess you could say, that I've ever covered. But, if anyone else out there has a question you'd like to ask, you can always send something in. You can send it to me by email. You can send it to MattSchorr@hotmail.com. That's MattSchorr @hotmail.com. Or you can shoot me a question via Twitter using the hashtag #SmallTownJournalist. Just send it to my Twitter account, which is @TheMattSchorr. And, of course, as far as all of our social media plugs, we'll just move into that right now. If you'd like to follow along with our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/Schorr Manor. That's SchorrManor. You can, of course, if you feel so inclined, buy t-shirts to show your support for Schorr Manor and this podcast. There's a button right there on our Facebook page. Also, if you'd like to show a little bit more support, you can follow along our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Schorr Manor. We've got several cool rewards tiers there if you feel like you'd like to contribute and throw your name in the pot. And as far as other ways that you can connect with me, I have a website. That's www.mattschorr.net. And of course, there's my email address, mattschorr@hotmail.com, and my Twitter account, @TheMattSchorr. I also have an Instagram account where you can follow along, and that's @TheSchorr. That's TheSchorr. And I believe that'll bring another episode to a close. So I'll say once again, thanks for checking out another episode. Keep listening and keep reading.